On a misty morning in May of 1453, the ancient stones of Constantinople trembled under the thunder of cannon fire. For over 1,000 years, these walls had stood unbroken, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, the clash of armies, and the prayers of millions. They had turned back Huns and Arabs, Vikings and Bulgars, each wave of conquest breaking against their mighty ramparts, like water against an unyielding cliff. But on this morning, something was different. The sound echoing across the Golden Horn was not the familiar clatter of siege ladders or the whistle of arrows. It was the roar of gunpowder, the crack of stone, and the birth cry of a new age of warfare. This is the story of how the greatest fortress in the medieval world finally fell, not to superior numbers alone, but to a revolution in military technology that would change warfare forever. It is a tale of desperate courage against overwhelming odds, of an empire's final stand, and of walls that had protected Christendom for centuries crumbling before the relentless advance of Ottoman ambition. To understand the magnitude of what happened in 1453, we must first journey back to witness the glory of what was about to be lost. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the new Rome, the queen of cities. For over 11 centuries, it had stood as the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome itself. Its massive walls, stretching from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, were not merely fortifications. They were symbols of imperial power, monuments to engineering genius, and the last great barrier between Christian Europe and the expanding Islamic world. The Theodosian Walls, named after the emperor who ordered their construction in the early 5th century, represented the pinnacle of ancient defensive architecture. These were not simple barriers of stone and mortar. They were a sophisticated system of triple defenses that had turned back every assault for 800 years. The outer perimeter began with a wide moat, 60 feet across and filled with water when needed. Behind this lay the outer wall, 25 feet high and studded with towers. Then came an open space, a killing ground where attackers could be trapped and destroyed. Finally stood the inner wall, the true guardian of the city, 40 feet high and 15 feet thick, bristling with 96 towers that rose even higher into the sky. For centuries, these walls had been the graveyard of empires. Arab armies had crashed against them and been repelled. Bulgarian Khans had seen their warriors broken on these stones. The mighty Rus had sailed down from the north with 1,000 ships, only to retreat in defeat. Even the crusading armies of the Fourth Crusade had struggled to breach them, succeeding only through treachery and political manipulation rather than military might. The walls had earned their reputation as the most impregnable fortification in the world. But by the dawn of the 15th century, the empire that had built these magnificent defenses was dying. What had once been a realm stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Crimea to Crete, had shrunk to little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories. The Black Death had ravaged the city's population. Economic decline had emptied the imperial treasury. Political instability had weakened the government. By 1450, the great metropolis that had once housed 400,000 souls was home to fewer than 50,000. Its vast interior dotted with empty fields and abandoned neighborhoods, like gaps in a mouth full of broken teeth. Into this vacuum stepped a young sultan whose ambitions matched the vastness of his empire. Mehmed II, barely 21 years old when he set his sights on Constantinople, was no ordinary ruler. He was a man of fierce intelligence and boundless determination, a student of history who understood that the conquest of Constantinople would not merely add another city to his realm. It would complete the transformation of the Ottomans from a frontier principality into a world empire, the heir to both Rome and Byzantium. Mehmed's preparations for the siege were unlike anything the medieval world had seen. He assembled an army that stretched beyond the horizon, perhaps 120,000 men drawn from every corner of his empire. Anatolian cavalry, elite Janissary infantry, engineers from across Europe, sailors from the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This was not merely an army, it was the concentrated might of an empire bent on conquest. But Mehmed's greatest weapon was not the size of his forces or the skill of his generals. It was a revolution in military technology that would forever change the nature of siege warfare. In the winter of 1452, a Hungarian engineer named Orban appeared at the Ottoman court with a proposal that would seal Constantinople's fate. He claimed he could build a cannon capable of shattering any fortification, no matter how thick or how ancient. The story of Orban's employment reveals the tragic irony of Constantinople's final days. The engineer had first offered his services to Emperor Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor. But the imperial treasury was empty, the resources exhausted. Constantine could offer only a meager stipend, barely enough to keep the man fed, let alone fund the construction of revolutionary siege weapons. Disappointed and unpaid, Orban left the city and made his way to the Ottoman court, where Sultan Mehmed received him with open arms and unlimited resources. When Mehmed asked whether such a cannon could breach the walls of Constantinople, Orban's reply was chilling in its confidence. "I can cast a cannon of bronze with the capacity of the stone you want. I have examined the walls of the city in great detail. I can shatter to dust not only these walls with the stones from my gun, but the very walls of Babylon itself." The weapon that emerged from Orban's foundry was a monster of bronze and iron, 27 feet long with a barrel over 2 feet in diameter. Its bronze walls were 8 inches thick, and it could hurl stone balls weighing over 1,300 pounds for more than a mile. This was not merely a cannon. It was a siege engine that represented the future of warfare, the death knell of the age of castles and walls. As winter turned to spring in 1453, the great cannon was dragged by 60 oxen along the roads of Thrace, its passage marking the approach of doom for the ancient city. Behind it came the vast Ottoman host, a moving sea of banners and steel that darkened the countryside. Mehmed had spent months in preparation, gathering supplies, positioning ships, coordinating the complex logistics of besieging one of the world's greatest fortified cities. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI prepared for what he knew would be his final battle. The last emperor of Byzantium was a man of quiet courage and deep faith, who understood that his empire's survival hung by the thinnest of threads. His forces were pitifully small compared to the Ottoman host approaching his gates. Perhaps 5,000 Greeks and fewer than 2,000 foreign allies, mainly Genoese and Venetians, who had stayed to fight for the city that had been their home and their fortune. Constantine knew the mathematics of the siege were hopeless. His tiny army had to defend 14 miles of walls against an enemy that outnumbered them by more than 20 to 1. His navy consisted of just 26 ships, most belonging to Italian merchants, facing an Ottoman fleet that blackened the waters of the Bosphorus. His treasury was empty, his allies distant, his people exhausted by decades of decline and defeat. Yet Constantine chose to stand and fight. In the Orthodox tradition, he was not merely an emperor defending his capital. He was the last guardian of the Roman Empire, the final link in a chain of rule that stretched back 1,500 years to Augustus Caesar himself. To abandon Constantinople would be to abandon not just a city, but the very idea of Rome, the dream of Christian empire, the heritage of a civilization. As April dawned in 1453, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic confrontations. On one side stood the dying remnant of the world's oldest empire, protected by walls that had never fallen, defended by men who knew they were fighting not just for their lives, but for their very identity as Romans and Christians. On the other side gathered the rising power of the Islamic world, armed with weapons that would revolutionize warfare, led by a young sultan whose vision of conquest knew no bounds. The siege that was about to begin would be more than a military campaign. It would be the collision of two worlds, two faiths, two ages of human history. In the balance hung not just the fate of a single city, but the future of Europe itself. The morning of April 2nd brought with it the sound that Constantinople had dreaded for months. The rhythmic thunder of marching feet, the clatter of armor, the creak of wagon wheels carrying the instruments of war. From the landward walls, the defenders watched in grim fascination as the Ottoman army deployed across the fields beyond the city, a vast carpet of tents and banners that seemed to stretch to the very edge of the world. Mehmed had chosen his positions with the eye of a master strategist. His main camp was established directly opposite the weakest section of the Theodosian Walls, the area known as the Mesoteichion, where the land rose slightly and the fortifications were oldest. Here he placed his great cannon, the bronze monster that Orban had crafted for this very moment. Around it, he positioned his elite Janissary corps, the Sultan's household troops, whose discipline and ferocity were legendary across 2 continents. The sight of the great gun sent ripples of unease through the city's defenders. Veterans who had fought in a dozen campaigns had never seen anything like it. The cannon squatted on its massive wooden platform like some primordial beast, its bronze muzzle gaping toward the walls that had protected Constantinople since the days when Rome still ruled the West. Even at a distance, its size was intimidating, a physical manifestation of the technological revolution that was reshaping warfare across Europe. But Mehmed's preparations extended far beyond a single weapon, no matter how impressive. The Ottoman siege lines stretched for miles, a complex network of trenches, earthworks, and artillery positions that demonstrated the Sultan's understanding of modern siegecraft. Supply lines snaked back toward Adrianople, ensuring that his massive army would not lack for food, ammunition, or reinforcements. Engineer Corps began the methodical work of approaching the walls, digging zigzag trenches that would allow attackers to advance under cover. Most ominously of all, the Ottoman fleet had taken control of the Bosphorus, cutting off any hope of relief by sea. The sight of Turkish galleys patrolling the waters where Byzantine ships had once ruled supreme drove home the reality of Constantinople's isolation. The city was now truly alone, cut off from the wider world, dependent entirely on its own resources and the courage of its defenders. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine moved among his troops with the calm dignity that had marked his entire reign. He knew the odds they faced, understood the mathematics of the siege better than anyone. Yet he showed no sign of despair or panic. Instead, he threw himself into the work of preparing the city's defenses with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had accepted his fate but refused to surrender without a fight. The emperor's greatest challenge was not the enemy beyond the walls, but the sheer length of the fortifications he had to defend. 14 miles of walls with fewer than 7,000 men meant that each defender was responsible for protecting more than 10 feet of rampart. It was an impossible task by any measure, yet Constantine set about organizing his forces with remarkable skill. The most reliable troops, his own Byzantine regulars and the Genoese volunteers under Giovanni Giustiniani, were assigned to the most vulnerable sections of the wall. The Genoese commander, a veteran of many sieges, had arrived in January with 700 professional soldiers and had quickly established himself as Constantine's most trusted lieutenant. Together, they worked to shore up weak points in the fortifications, positioning the city's limited artillery to best effect, and organizing the civilian population to support the defense. For the citizens of Constantinople, the approach of the Ottoman army marked the beginning of a nightmare that would test their endurance to the breaking point. Families huddled in their homes as the thunder of cannon fire echoed through the streets. Churches filled with people seeking divine protection, their prayers mixing with the sound of falling masonry as Ottoman artillery found its range. The great chain that stretched across the Golden Horn, Constantinople's famous harbor, became a symbol of the city's defiance. Forged centuries earlier to protect the harbor from naval attack, the chain had been raised again to prevent Ottoman ships from entering the inlet. Its massive iron links, each as thick as a man's arm, glittered in the morning sun like a necklace of steel across the blue waters. On April 6th, after days of preparation and positioning, Mehmed gave the order that would change the course of history. Along the 4-mile front facing the city's landward walls, Ottoman gunners lit the fuses of their cannons. The world's first sustained artillery bombardment erupted in a crescendo of fire and thunder that could be heard for miles across the countryside. The great cannon's first shot struck the walls with an impact that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. A section of ancient masonry, stones that had been laid by Roman engineers 1,000 years before, crumbled into dust and rubble. The defenders watched in stunned silence as their supposedly impregnable fortifications began to disintegrate under the relentless pounding of Ottoman artillery. Yet even as the walls began to crumble, the spirit of the defenders remained unbroken. As each section of fortification collapsed, work gangs rushed forward to fill the gaps with earth, timber, and whatever materials they could find. Women and children joined the effort, carrying baskets of soil and broken stone to repair the breaches that Ottoman cannon had torn in their city's defenses. The bombardment continued day after day, a relentless pounding that wore down both stone and spirit. The great cannon could fire only 7 times a day, each shot requiring hours of preparation and cooling. But when it spoke, its voice carried the authority of a new age, each stone ball weighing over half a ton as it crashed into walls that had weathered 8 centuries of siege. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical damage. The defenders had grown up hearing stories of the wall's invincibility, tales of mighty armies that had broken themselves against these very stones. Now they watched helplessly as Ottoman artillery reduced their legendary fortifications to rubble, chunk by grinding chunk. Constantine himself was often seen at the most dangerous points along the wall, rallying his men and sharing their dangers. His presence in the midst of the bombardment became a source of inspiration for the defenders, proof that their emperor would not ask them to face perils he was unwilling to share. When sections of wall collapsed, he was among the first to organize repair efforts. When Ottoman assault troops tested the defenses, he was there with sword in hand. The siege settled into a deadly routine. By day, Ottoman cannons pounded the walls, while engineers crept closer through their approach trenches. By night, the defenders worked frantically to repair the damage, knowing that each dawn would bring fresh destruction. The great cannon had developed a crack after days of continuous firing, but Ottoman engineers managed to repair it, and the bombardment continued without pause. As April wore on, it became clear that this was unlike any siege in the long history of Constantinople. The methodical destruction of the walls, the coordinated pressure from land and sea, the sheer scale of Ottoman preparations, all marked this as something new and terrible. The age of gunpowder had arrived at the gates of the last Roman city, and nothing would ever be the same. The defenders of Constantinople soon discovered that facing Orban's great cannon was only the beginning of their nightmare. Mehmed had assembled an entire arsenal of artillery pieces, each designed for a specific purpose in the systematic destruction of the city's defenses. Smaller cannons hammered at the towers, their rapid fire chipping away at the ancient masonry like a mason's chisel carving stone. Medium-sized guns targeted the gates, seeking to blast open the massive portals that had sealed the city against invasion for centuries. But it was the great cannon that captured the imagination and terror of both sides. Each time it fired, the earth trembled for miles around. Horses reared in panic. Birds fled from the trees. The very air seemed to split apart with the force of its discharge. Ottoman soldiers, even those who served the gun, covered their ears and stepped back in awe as the bronze monster belched fire and smoke into the morning air. The stone balls it hurled were works of art in their own right, carved from granite quarries in Anatolia and polished smooth by master craftsmen. Each projectile represented months of labor, from the quarrying of the stone to its careful shaping and transport to the siege lines. When these massive spheres struck the Theodosian Walls, they did not merely crack the ancient stones. They pulverized them, turning Roman masonry into clouds of dust that hung in the air like morning mist. For the defenders, watching their legendary walls disintegrate was like witnessing the end of the world. These were not ordinary fortifications. They were the physical embodiment of Roman power, the last tangible link to an empire that had ruled the Mediterranean for over a millennium. Every stone had a history. Every tower bore the marks of previous sieges. Every section told the story of Constantinople's long defiance of its enemies. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had become Constantine's right hand, understood better than most what they were witnessing. He had fought in siege warfare across Europe and had seen the gradual evolution of artillery. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the systematic destruction that Orban's guns were visiting upon the city. The science of fortification, perfected over centuries of warfare, was being rendered obsolete in a matter of days. The Genoese commander threw himself into the work of adaptation with the desperation of a man who knew his life depended on finding solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Where the great cannon had blasted holes in the outer wall, he ordered the construction of earthwork barriers behind the gaps. Where towers had been reduced to rubble, he positioned groups of crossbowmen and handgunners to sweep the approaches with missile fire. Most ingeniously, Giustiniani began the construction of what would later be called a fausse braie, a low earthwork wall built behind the main fortifications. This secondary defense was designed not to stop cannonballs, which would simply pass through the loose earth, but to provide a fighting platform from which defenders could engage attackers who had breached the outer wall. It was a recognition that the age of passive defense was ending, replaced by a new era where fortifications would need to be actively manned and constantly modified. The work of repair and adaptation never ceased. As soon as the Ottoman bombardment paused for the day, usually in the late afternoon when the guns had grown too hot to fire safely, the defenders swarmed over the damaged sections like ants rebuilding their nest. Men, women, and children formed human chains to pass baskets of earth and broken stone to the breaches. Priests moved among the workers, blessing their efforts and offering prayers for divine protection. The civilian population of Constantinople showed remarkable resilience in the face of the bombardment. Rather than flee in panic, most citizens threw themselves into supporting the defense with a determination born of desperation. They understood, perhaps better than the soldiers, that there would be no escape if the city fell. Ottoman practice in conquest was well known. Surrender might bring mercy, but a city taken by storm could expect no quarter. Workshops throughout the city converted their production to military needs. Blacksmiths forged spear points and arrowheads. Carpenters built scaling ladders and siege engines. Rope makers wove cables for the great chain across the Golden Horn. Even the city's famous silk weavers contributed, producing banners and standards to maintain morale among the defenders. The religious life of the city intensified as the siege wore on. Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral that had been the center of Eastern Christianity for 9 centuries, became a focal point for the city's prayers. Processions wound through the streets carrying icons and relics, while priests chanted litanies that had sustained the faithful through previous crises. The Patriarch of Constantinople led daily services, invoking the protection of the Virgin Mary, who was believed to be the special guardian of the city. Yet even as the citizens prayed for divine intervention, the reality of their situation grew more desperate with each passing day. Food supplies, never abundant in the besieged city, began to run dangerously low. The Ottoman blockade had cut off all sources of provisions from outside, while the constant bombardment made it impossible to tend gardens or maintain normal agricultural activities within the walls. Emperor Constantine established strict rationing, ensuring that the military defenders received priority in the distribution of food. But even the soldiers were reduced to meager rations of bread, cheese, and whatever vegetables could be scrounged from abandoned gardens. Water was less of a problem, as the city had numerous wells and cisterns, but the quality deteriorated as the siege dragged on and sanitation became increasingly difficult to maintain. The Ottoman bombardment followed a relentless pattern that wore down both the physical defenses and the mental endurance of the besieged. Each morning brought the thunder of cannon fire. Each afternoon saw desperate repair work. Each night offered only brief respite before the cycle began again. The great cannon, despite its impressive destructive power, was limited by the time required to load and cool between shots. But the smaller artillery pieces maintained an almost continuous barrage that made movement along the walls extremely dangerous. Mehmed himself took an active interest in the bombardment, often visiting the gun positions to observe the damage and consult with his artillery specialists. The young Sultan had studied the science of siege warfare with the intensity he brought to all his pursuits, and he understood that the psychological impact of the bombardment was as important as its physical effects. Each crumbling section of wall, each collapsing tower, sent a message to the defenders that their situation was hopeless. The Ottoman Sultan also understood the importance of maintaining pressure from multiple directions. While his artillery pounded the landward walls, his fleet probed for weaknesses in the sea defenses. Ottoman galleys tested the great chain across the Golden Horn, seeking to break through into the harbor where they could attack the city from an unexpected direction. Raiding parties struck at the few remaining Byzantine outposts around the city, eliminating any possibility of relief from external sources. The fall of Constantinople on May 29, 1453, marked more than the end of a siege. It signaled the death of an empire that had endured for over a millennium and the birth of a new age where gunpowder would reshape the very nature of warfare. The ancient walls that had protected Christendom finally crumbled, not to superior courage or divine will, but to the relentless mathematics of bronze and stone, proving that even the mightiest fortresses must yield to the march of technology.